Back on the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. His website, Prof. Wolff, his Twitter handle is Prof. Wolff, P-R-O-F-W-O-L-F-F. His websites are democracyatwork.info and rdwolff with 2fs.com. Dr. Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
I mentioned in the first hour of my program today that the New York Times has a fascinating story about how Portugal said to the European Union, you guys all want austerity. You want to cut Social Security, you want to cut pensions, you want to reduce wages, you want to dial back on health care, you want to dial back on housing support. You basically want to, want all of us to contract essentially the welfare state or the support state by 20% or so. And we're not going to do that. Screw that. We're gonna go full steam ahead. They had a leftist president who was elected in 2015, and this was what he campaigned on. And 3 years on, and when he did this, when they said this, the Europeans said, "You're going to go down the tubes fast." And in fact, Portugal's really rocking and rolling right now. It's the only economy in Europe apparently that's really growing. What's going on there? Where did this austerity come from? Where did the idea come from? How did it get its foot and its roots into the Eurozone or the European Union? Why is it being supported by so many countries? And how is Portugal's pushing back on this and proving a proof of concept, demonstrating that this is a bunch of BS?
Well, it's mostly a political question. The government in Portugal is an alliance of three parties. The Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and the Green Party, and together they are running Portugal, and they made the decision that they're not going to do a trickle-down economics, which is what everyone else in Europe pretty much has done, despite elections in places like Greece and France for political parties that were committed to what the Portuguese did but never carried it through. That's the power of ideology, Tom. Basically, the idea is whatever the government does, it has to do it first and foremost by helping those at the top, the wealthiest folks, the corporations, in the presumption that the help to them will trickle down to everybody else. We did that in the United States as well, starting with the stimulus programs under Bush, carried forward under Obama, and now being pursued by Mr. Trump. Trickle down is the orthodoxy with which the people who run the capitalist system try to fix its breakdowns, like the one in 2008. But there was always the alternative, which I like to call trickle up. In other words, what the government does, instead of helping corporations by bailing them out and giving them the big contracts and giving them the big tax cuts, you don't do that. You help the people at the bottom. You give them all kinds of supports, all kinds of government handouts, etc., on the presumption that by doing that, they will all be able then to go out and spend money, and that will stimulate the corporations. In other words, you help those at the bottom, and it trickles up into the coffers of business and eventually the rich people who own and control the businesses. Trickle up has always been an alternative to trickle down. When Franklin Roosevelt became president back in the 30s, in the depths of our depression, he was actually committed to trickle down, as were the people running both political parties. It was the pressure from below of a unionized a CIO and all of that back in the 1930s that basically turned him from a trickle-downer into a trickle-upper. And so he began to shift, and that had a lot to do with the ultimate success of the New Deal. And basically what the Portuguese have done is replicate the New Deal and say, we're going in that route. And from just between you and me, the beauty of what they've done is, look, both trickle up and trickle down may fail. Capitalism is a system that isn't easy to fix. But at least you know, if you go the trickle up route, that you've helped the majority of people, whether or not it's a solution that lasts. Whereas if you use trickle down, you've helped the people who need it least and who are a small minority. And if on top of that you get a failure, well, then you really have very little to show for how you handled one of capitalism's terrible downturns.
So why the resistance to trickle up among the rest of the European nations?
Well, because in a sense, it always carries a certain risk. If capitalism, which really everybody recognizes is run by a relatively small group of people who sit at the top of the society and dispense with all of the wealth, etc., if that system breaks down and the only thing you can really do is to help the mass of people from the bottom, you're going to sooner or later stimulate the question on the part of the people at the bottom, the majority, why in the world do we ever allow the system to be run by that minority that got us into the mess if getting us the help we've always wanted is what gets us out of the mess? Maybe if we ran the show and if the wealth were much more equally distributed, we wouldn't get into the mess, needing us to find mechanisms out. It basically shifts the power distribution, if you like. It shifts the ideological ground of the society to see the problem being produced by the capitalists at the top and the solution being a direct helping of people at the bottom. That's why it was so important in the 30, 40 years after the end of World War II to basically roll back the New Deal, to show hardly in any way possible that helping people at the bottom is the solution. That had to be transformed into being the problem that we now discuss it at. It's kind of a perfect analogy to what you were doing before in showing how faith-based approaches to government policy are such a complete reversal of what Jefferson, Franklin, and others had said.
Yeah, remarkable stuff. Professor Richard Wolff, the other big question I had for you is, how do we measure the benefit of an economy? The metric that is used by the popular press, by and large, is the stock market. Secondarily is the unemployment rate. But it seems that, we've got a great unemployment rate right now. It's very low, and we've got a really high stock market. But it sure looks to me like the majority of Americans, working Americans, are in trouble. 40% of Americans can't sustain a $500 medical expense. They can't deal with it. A $1,000 expense will throw them into bankruptcy. How do we come up with a new way of saying, okay, here's our economic indicator today? This is what it's saying.
Well, I think, here, usually I'm a critic of the economics profession of which I'm a part, but here, to be fair to the economics tradition, a proper school student learns that using one or two indices of how well an economy is doing is silly and absurd, and not only unscientific, it is plain stupid. An economy is a very complicated thing. You don't capture its condition by looking at any one number, and certainly not the stock market level or the unemployment rate. Let me give you just a couple of examples. 10% of Americans own 85% of all the shares. So if the shares, the value of shares on the stock market, what we get by the Dow Industrial Index or the Russell 2000 or any of the others, is an index of how well those 10% are doing who have any kind of stock. And by the way, most of those people don't have enough to make a big difference. So the real beneficiaries of the level of the stock market is a tiny minority of American people. And there's no correlation between the stock market being up and the well-being of the society as a whole. And the same thing applies to unemployment, although it's better than the stock market because at least it's something that's broad-based. But, most Americans are upset, as your comment indicates, not so much by having or not having a job, since the majority of Americans do have a job and have had it throughout this time. But the real question is, what kind of a job? What does it pay? What are the benefits that go with it? What kind of development of the human personality does it make possible? What kinds of opportunities for advancement? What is happening to the young people coming in? And by all of those metrics that I just listed, we are in fact in the kind of trouble that the interesting number you mentioned, the $400 or $500 that most Americans today cannot put their hands on to deal with an emergency, those are the indicators that give you a much richer sense. It's usually the president, to be honest, and not just Trump, but the others too. It's usually the president who gives enormous emphasis in his or her remarks every day on the indexes that make them look good. So yes, the stock market and the unemployment rate make them look good, and they don't mention all of the others that make the insight much richer and much more accurate.
Yeah. So there's no what things would you put into the basket of measurements? You mentioned.
Well, here's some of those that the economics profession routinely teaches. Here's the big one: the distribution of income and wealth. Much better index of how people feel is how they understand their own position in the distribution of wealth, how they compare to the Joneses down the street or to their cousins across the country. How are they faring in terms of the American dream? Is it affordable to them or not? Are they spending, for example, more than 20% of their income on rental, on housing? There's a situation that gives you a lot of insight into the lives that people lead. The level of debt of the country, both its corporate debt, its government debt, and its individual debt would be a very strong sign. The number of, to get more specific, the percentage of young people aged, say, 25 who are still living with their parents is a very famous kind of example. There's a whole rich list that have been developed by economists and sociologists and others trying to get a handle on how you would measure something. Retreating to unemployment and the stock market, that's simply a ploy of those in power who want to have the situation look good, to claim some basis for what they're saying all the time, but it's not a serious effort to understand what's going on.
I remember the King of Bhutan coming up with his National Happiness Index, and it got publicized all over the place. I think whoever comes up with a formula taking those variables and says, okay, here's the Wolff formula, will be recognized for it. Dr. Richard Wolff, thank you so much for being with us.